Hi, welcome to the Child Anxiety FAQ podcast. FAQ stands for Frequently Asked Questions, and I'm answering listener questions about child and teen anxiety. My name is Dawn Friedman, and I've been working with kids and families for more than 30 years. I've been a preschool teacher, a parent educator, a family case manager, a clinical counselor, and now I'm the owner and operator of Open Book Parenting, where I support parents of anxious kids. This episode's question is, how is perfectionism related to child anxiety? I didn't actually have someone ask this particular question. Instead, they came to me for a consult. They were describing what was going on with their child, and I explained that this looked like perfectionism, and they had a lot of questions about how that relates to anxiety. So let's get into that. Perfectionism is a real challenge to work on because perfectionism gets a lot of praise, and it can be really effective. I feel like this is especially true because we prize people reaching for perfection. You reach for the stars, you try your best, you work your hardest, and that can be good, except when it is not. When I have parents who come to me about child anxiety and we see that there is perfectionism in the way their child is living out their anxiety, it can sometimes be a hard sell for parents to accept that their child's positive behaviors, that their accomplishments can be a sign of anxiety. Instead, they'll be looking at other aspects, and I encourage them to see the whole picture because we do need to intervene in the perfectionism, even if on the surface it looks like it's a help. This can be doubly difficult if the parent themselves has perfectionist anxiety, and that is often the case because remember, anxiety begets anxiety. We pass our anxiety to our kids pass their anxiety to us, and that's because they inherit our brains from us. And so if we have an anxious brain, it is more likely that our child will have an anxious brain, but also because anxiety is catching in the moment. If you're feeling anxious, I am likely to catch that. If I am feeling anxious, you are likely to catch that. But then also because anxiety can be taught, and perfectionist anxiety especially can be taught. And it's a pattern I see a lot in the work that I do. There'll be a parent who has very strong ideas about how a room should be cleaned or how a child should do homework, or it often shows up with expectations about how people eat. And then the child learns these values and takes them into their own anxious brain, and that perfectionism shows up again. Now, as I have said, you can parent two kids the exact same way. So a perfectionist parent can try perfectionism in their parenting with two kids, and one will be a perfectionist and one will not. It's just the way things are. But let's talk about what perfectionism looks like. Perfectionism is the child who, for example, erases holes in their paper because they want to get their handwriting exactly right or the math problem exactly right. Maybe they crumple up pictures that they've drawn. They don't like the way their picture looks, or they won't draw with you because your picture looks better, and that is frustrating and upsetting to them. These are kids who can't lose when they're playing a game and will get very angry or upset if somebody else wins. These are kids who may tear down their Lego models when it's not coming out exactly right or they find themselves getting stuck. Very often, these kids tend to do things a little bit later. They can be late talkers or late walkers. And then as soon as they start talking, they're talking in full sentences. Or as soon as they start walking, they are so adept on their feet because they like to do things exactly right before they do them at all. These are kids who can look like underachievers. They don't want to do anything unless they're going to be able to do it well, and so they give up right away. These are kids who might be totally excelling in school, straight A's, turning in all their homework, doing all of the extra credit. And these can also be kids who are completely stymied and frozen because, again, if they can't do it perfectly, they won't do it at all. I was attending a high school graduation a couple of years back and listening to them talk about the class valedictorian, who was incredibly impressive, had done all of these amazing things, had more than a 4-point GPA, had been doing tons of volunteer work beyond the work at school. I was thinking about perfectionism in that moment because I happened to know that child socially. And I knew that child struggled with severe, often crippling anxiety that didn't come out in their academic work, because their academic work, as I was sharing, was stellar. It came out in the rest of their functioning, their self-esteem, their self-concept, their social life. I knew this child struggled with headaches and stomach aches and had been in an intensive outpatient program. And I just sat there thinking about how much pain that child had been in throughout high school that wasn't recognized, that were celebrating these accomplishments that were impressive, but also maybe were unrealistic, not just for other kids, but also for this child. These accomplishments had come at a cost. And because I knew this child socially and knew their parents socially, I knew that their parents also struggled with this because their kid was getting all this praise. And so when they were working around this child's anxiety, it was difficult for the entire family to unpack how to do this, how to approach this. I will tell you that this child later on ended up taking a break from higher education in order to really address those mental health needs that came to a head in their sophomore year, and they needed to withdraw from school and take care of themselves and really confront this anxious perfectionism. If you're wondering if your child has anxious perfectionism instead of just high standards, again, where we look is avoidance. Is the child avoiding failure? Do you notice that they are unwilling to do things that they might fail at, or are applying themselves so intensely that they're missing out on other things? An example of this might be a child who says, you know what, I'm going to take German because I heard that German makes it more likely to get scholarships, and then is so struggling with German and is committed to getting a straight A, like perfect, 100% on everything, plus extra credit so they can get more than 100% on German, and so they're missing out on sleep, or they're missing out on hanging out with the family and watching a show, or they're missing out on spending time with friends. That is a child who is overcommitted to German. Now, the problem is not German in particular, or foreign languages in general. The problem is that the child is missing out on life because they believe that they must do it perfectly or not at all. Again, when I'm talking to parents, they will tell me with pride how much their child is giving up in order to do things especially well. They'll talk to me about how their child has so much self-control, so much persistence, so much commitment to things that the parent is missing out on what the child is avoiding, which is failure, which is balance, which is reasonable expectations. We all need to learn how to fail. We all need to learn how to do things, not because we can conquer them and be the best, but because things are worth doing. A child with anxious perfectionism may seem out in the world as if they're doing incredibly well, like the valedictorian I was talking about, but parents might see more struggle at home. They might see more tears. They might see a child who gets angry and irritable with the family. They might see a child who melts down when they are asked to come and join the family for dinner instead of studying, come and do this weekend event instead of staying home and cramming for the exam on Monday. Look for avoidance. Now, personally, I think perfectionism always invites a careful and critical eye. That doesn't mean that we should always say perfectionism is bad. But we should look at it and say, is this avoidance? Is this anxious perfectionism? Is this just a child who wants to learn to do things well? Or is this a child who is so focused on doing things well that the rest of the world has faded into the background? Now, there are certain ages where you can expect a child to get really fixated on a task, and that's fine and is not atypical. Kids can get into fads like they spend all their time practicing tennis or trying to perfect the yo-yo. Like if you ever give a kid a yo-yo or a Rubik's Cube or something like that, they might become really fixated on it for a little while, and then it disappears into the clutter of the house, and one day you pick it up and go, when is the last time my kid played with a yo-yo? That's normal and developmentally appropriate. A child who becomes incredibly fixated as a special interest, that's also not a problem if they're enjoying it, if it's really a preference. Anxious perfectionism is less about joy and pleasure and more about feeling driven. A child who feels they cannot stop even though there's something else they might want to do. Anxious perfectionism can show up as eating issues, and those should be assessed by a pediatrician, by a healthcare provider, sometimes by a mental health professional with special training in eating. And I want to just talk about this really quick. It's much too big for a podcast just on perfectionism. But if you have a child who is very rigid about their eating, avoiding certain foods, is very rigid about tracking what they eat, that is a concern. This is not a child who is showing great willpower, which sometimes people will say. This is a child who is stuck in loops of anxious avoidance and perfectionism, because in real life, unless you have something like a peanut allergy, foods are just food. Sometimes this can show up as a child who's eating vegetarian or vegan, and sometimes that's for really appropriate reasons, like concern about animal welfare. But sometimes it is a child that is using this as a cover for anxious perfectionism in food. Now, I am not saying eating disorder, but this can be disordered eating, and kids with anxious perfectionism are more vulnerable to having struggles with eating. So I just kind of wanted to get your eyes on that too. If you have some anxious perfectionism around eating, and is this something you're unintentionally visiting on your kids? This is a big topic. I understand that. If you have questions specifically about your child's anxious perfectionism, I encourage you to schedule a free consult call with me. You can do that at my website, openbookparenting.com, and I can help you figure out, is this just like a kid with high standards, or is this anxious perfectionism and is our family caught in some anxiety loops? I hope that this podcast was helpful and gave you some things to think about. I would really appreciate it if you would rate and subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That'll help people discover my episodes and get some more questions coming in. Speaking of which, if you have a question you'd like me to answer on the show, you can go to openbookparenting.com, click podcast up in the menu, and that will take you to an anonymous submission form. You can put your question there, and who knows, maybe I'll answer it on the show.